Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Ryan Burrows, Executive Director of the American Kratom Association. We are joined this evening by Mac Haddo, Senior Fellow on Public Policy. We called this meeting tonight to discuss a very exciting town hall we have scheduled in Las Vegas on February 16th, the status of the ban bill in Nebraska, Florida's KCPA amendments, and many more updates that we want to make sure you are aware of as we continue to roll out our efforts here at the AKA in 2024. The Q&A is open throughout the webinar, so please be sure to get your questions in. And with that, I will turn it over to Mac.
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks everyone for joining us. Ryan referenced the very exciting opportunity we've got coming up during the CHAMP show, which is the trade show for business-to-business sales. And traditionally, Kratom has been a large and growing part of that show in terms of the number of vendors and buyers that are there interested in Kratom products. And we typically, at the American Kratom Association, will host a discussion and a presentation during the show. This year, we have secured a commitment from one of our federal KCPA sponsors, Congressman Jack Bergman, who will lead a panel discussion relating to the benefits that Kratom has for veterans, first responders, and others who really are at the front lines in defending our country, and who, because of service-related injuries, obviously struggle with the threat, in many cases, of having addictions to very dangerous substances that become unmanageable. And we have seen this reported to us over and over from veterans, particularly, who discuss these kinds of issues that they struggle with. So we're very grateful that Congressman Bergman has made the commitment to travel to Las Vegas to participate in this important presentation. And we think it's very important for the vendors and buyers of Kratom products to understand a little better about the clientele that they are seeking to secure as customers, to understand why they benefit from Kratom as they go forward. So very exciting. Anyone who is in the Las Vegas area it's on February 16th at 4 p.m. That's a Friday afternoon at the convention center. We'll circulate specific information in terms of the room location, but I can tell you it'd be great to have you come by, and we welcome you participating in that event. There'll be an invitation that goes out for any that are in the area at the time. For those that don't live there or aren't within easy driving distance, you might think about coming to Las Vegas in the middle of February, probably better than you with many areas of the country that are obviously suffering from very cold weather. I should tell you that I was at the National Conference of State Legislators meeting in Las Vegas a week ago, and it was pretty doggone cold there too. But I think things are warming up, and we've all suffered from this frigid weather here the last week or so. So that's an important event. Welcome everyone to come. We did want to talk today in this webinar to give everyone an update on some important issues. First, I'll run through some of the states, highlighting some of the challenges that we're having right now, giving you an update on some of the progress that we're achieving. And then we want to talk a little bit about the issues that we're seeing arise with the FDA, which I think are very significant in terms of our positioning Kratom in its proper role as a botanical supplement within the regulatory regimen that the FDA should be implementing for Kratom as we go forward. But let me start with the states. Many of you that are following on our Facebook page and through the alerts know that we recently had a hearing in the state of Florida. That was significant in that hearing in that we were able to present to the Senate Committee on Commerce and Tourism that Kratom, the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, which is strengthened from last year's bill, because at the end of the session, there was a lot of discussion about how much money the Department of Agriculture needed to enforce the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. And that led to a discussion between sessions with the Department of Agriculture on how we were going to do that. It's not been a unanimous verdict, but we finally came to an accommodation that we think works and that allows for the Department of Agriculture to adequately enforce the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, which is designed at its core to make certain that Kratom products that are introduced for sale, in this case in the state of Florida, are free from contaminants and adulterants, and that the labeling is appropriate to inform consumers about the products that they are consuming. We think that's critically important. And by the way, that's one area that we actually agreed with the Tampa Bay Times about, that there needed to be stronger labeling provisions, and there needed to be a regulatory scheme to make sure that we didn't have these dangerously adulterated products. However, the Tampa Bay Times refuses to acknowledge that their report, and I should say their false report, about the number of claimed deaths and adverse events associated with kratom are really not kratom deaths. And despite our best efforts to explain that to them, they still are trying to stay on the position that all kratom products are inherently dangerous, which, if you read their articles, is predicated on the FDA's position that kratom is dangerous. So I'll talk about that here in a couple of minutes, but the outcome of the Florida hearing was a unanimous vote to move forward. And even the critics that were generally represented by those in the addiction recovery community and among those who believe that kratom is responsible for deaths really made the case that we made, which is there needs to be better regulations going forward. And so that unanimous vote, of course, sets the stage for the discussions that will come in two more committees before the Senate, and then it'll be sent over, voted on the Senate and sent over to the House. We're optimistic and welcome that. The state of Georgia, yesterday we had a hearing again on strengthening the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. And for context, I should explain to you that Representative Rick Townsend, first-term Republican lawmaker, first filed the kratom ban bill last year. And I think through hours and hours of hearings and tough negotiations, we came to an agreement that the science does not justify a ban on kratom. And reluctantly, Representative Townsend agreed to go to a regulatory scheme. But I should tell you that Representative Townsend is, in my judgment, a good-hearted man and certainly committed to trying to protect consumers in this case. But I think he's been under the influence of the trial attorneys that are working with him. And despite his protests to the contrary, it is clear that they are the ones who are really directing his view about the current legislative framework that we've agreed to. And one of the provisions that was very troubling to us, just as an example, was that under the existing language, it would have criminalized the clerk in a convenience store with an aggravated misdemeanor that could eventually lead to a felony conviction. We thought that was inappropriate, and we maintain that it was certainly not the intent of the legislation, nor should have been, but it is the architecture that is drawn up by the trial attorneys, because the trial attorneys want to be able, in a court of law, when they're arguing product liability cases, to point to an action by the Georgia legislature which will say kratom is dangerous, so dangerous that it makes it a felony for someone to sell it under certain conditions in the state of Florida. Having that talking point for a jury is hardly the basis for ruining the lives of some people who may inadvertently make a mistake and be guilty of an aggravated misdemeanor and potentially a felony under that statute. So we're working hard to revise that. We have allies in the Georgia legislature who understand it. But if you want to know exactly how much influence the trial attorneys have, go to our Facebook page and you'll see pictures of Representative Townsend during his testimony when asked by a member of the Senate, the Georgia Senate, why he was encouraging and endorsing this provision that criminalized a clerk in a convenience store. He couldn't answer. And it took, and you'll see the second individual in those pictures is Matt Wetherington, the fierce advocate for the trial attorneys, who was explaining to and giving Representative Townsend the answer. And Representative Townsend didn't even know what his own bill said. It took the instruction and explanation of the trial attorneys, which I think is illustrative of the part of the problem. We wish Representative Townsend well, but I think he's going to have to learn that he cannot be the representative of this one-sided viewpoint in the kratom debate like the trial attorneys, because they have their agenda. It is clear. We all understand it, and it has nothing to do with protecting the health and safety of kratom consumers. It's all about trying to make sure that they build their case in court when they try to go for settlements or judgments against kratom manufacturers. And by the way, the AKA, because we are named parties in the suits that Mr. Wetherington and his firm consistently file. We fight those hard because we know that the premise upon which those states are moving forward are wrong. We're have another hearing tomorrow in Georgia, and I'm hopeful that we're going to get our language amended there, and that we'll then move forward with a well defined process for regulating kratom in the state of Georgia. We're optimistic and we look forward to it. Another great advancement is in the state of Wisconsin. In order to get and offset some of the objections of the Wisconsin Sheriff's Association, we've been in negotiation with the members of the committee, and we've secured a commitment for votes based on a concession that I know has caused some concern among our community, and I want to explain it. And that concession is that the enactment date of the Kratom Consumer Protection Act will be delayed for 6 months, and during that period of time, the Wisconsin Controlled Substances Board would have the opportunity to place an objection. Now, we're not concerned about that for a couple of reasons. One is that the Controlled Substances Board spent a year evaluating whether or not kratom meets the 8-factor analysis that is required under Wisconsin law and that mirrors the federal law. We know the outcome of that, and the Controlled Substances Board acknowledged that it doesn't meet the 8 factors that are required for scheduling. We also know that the actual position upon which the Controlled Substances Board, for those that were critics of kratom, relied, and that the Sheriff's Association universally relies on, is that kratom is dangerous. And of course, that's the FDA's narrative, and we all know that that's falling apart as we speak. So we're not concerned in the least about delaying that implementation date by 6 months, because we know that the science does not justify the actual 8 factors that are required for scheduling, even in the state of Wisconsin. So we're very enthusiastic and optimistic about having success there. And that's been a long haul, as all of you know. We're grateful for the Wisconsin supporters who showed up at the hearing and let their voices be heard, even though it was in the face of those sheriffs that sat there and I mean, literally were talking through their hats about kratom to the point of saying, had one, anecdotal example of a person that they thought was on kratom, couldn't prove it, didn't know, was found at an intersection with his foot still on the gas and was obviously impaired. And they said that they suspected it was a kratom incident. And it's silliness in order to do that, and certainly not something that would stand the light of day as we go forward. But we're, again, looking forward to movement in Wisconsin. In the state of Illinois, we had the Rules Committee vote out the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. That's a significant event because we've had objections from the Department of Health there, and we think that those are dissipating. And we have the commitment from great sponsors of the KCPA, Senator L.G. Sims, who is a leader in the Illinois Senate, and Marcus Evans, who's the majority leader in the House. These are strong sponsors. They're committed to it, and we're looking forward to be successful there. In Ohio, we're seeing continued progress with the KCPA. We're looking forward to getting that across the finish line. Ohio has a process that takes a long time, and they're currently dealing with budget issues, but they'll get back to our bill here for the second hearing that's required under the statute for that to take place. We're seeing great progress in North Carolina, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Michigan, and in a couple of other states where we think we have a chance to break through and get the Kratom Consumer Protection Act on the agenda for discussion as we go forward. A couple of really great things is that in the state of Rhode Island, the KCPA was filed. We have secured a Senate sponsor, which has been the problem in Rhode Island for the past 2 years. We have a strong sponsor that is committed to do it, and I think you can see that bill will be filed here in the next week in the Rhode Island legislature, and that will be, like Wisconsin, a turn from a ban to a KCPA regulated state. We expect that will happen in Arkansas, even though the Arkansas legislature is not in session this year. They only meet every other year, but the interim committee that unanimously approved the review of the KCPA legislation to remove the ban there and replace it with the KCPA, it was expected to have a hearing on that before that joint committee, health committee, in the Arkansas legislature here in the next 2 months. The one glaring thing that we've seen so far, and there may be others that get filed here, is that we know that the state of Nebraska, a state senator there, in a unicameral legislature, meaning there's only one body, they have a House and Senate combined, filed a ban bill. We have not yet been successful in getting his attention on the science and all the information that we can supply him. but we're working hard doing that. And we likely will call upon our Nebraska constituents to help us there here in the next week or so as we move forward. And so that's sort of a review of where we are with existing states as we're going forward here. I want to talk a little bit about the situation we're confronting with the enemy among us, which is what we're seeing in the marketplace. And I think this impacts every Kratom consumer. Is there is a race on among Kratom manufacturers to try to strengthen the potency and the effects of their Kratom product. And they escalate through concentration of the alkaloids in the Kratom plant. And we're concerned that perhaps even the metabolite 7-hydroxymetrogene. And so we're in the process of working with those manufacturers to establish safety standards where we can put in one bucket what we consider to be safe products based on consumer experiences and length of time of those products on the marketplace. And then in another bucket, we want to list unsafe products. I can tell you that I attempted to order a new product that's on the marketplace fairly recently that is pure 7-hydroxymetrogene, which is the metabolite that occurs in the drying process of the Kratom plant, but never gets to a level at which it poses any danger to the American people or consumers that ingest a Kratom product that has a level of 7-hydroxymetrogene that occurs within that drying process. But a artificially purified and synthesized 7-hydroxymetrogene product is not a Kratom product. It is, in fact, a very dangerous product. I attempted to order it. It's been on the market. We've reported it to the FDA. The FDA does nothing about it, as they've done for the 85 other products that we've submitted. They refuse to prosecute any of them. This is a dangerous product, in our opinion. And so when I attempted to order it, they rejected my order. Now, I thought that was pretty interesting. We had other people that they didn't recognize, I suppose, place an order, and they were successful. So it's not about whether or not they had a billing system or an ordering system that was defective. This was about they're trying to block someone like me with a known entity from getting acquisition of their product. And that should be of concern to everyone. We're going to push hard to see that that product is put in the bucket of unsafe products. And we hope that consumers, when they get the advisory that we put out from the American Kratom Association, will pay attention to those products that are deemed to be safe and those that are deemed to be unsafe, because we think that the unsafe products are threatening the existence of safe Kratom products in the marketplace. And it's time that we elevated the discussion about safe products going forward. Now, this is distinctly different from people that have concerns about extract products. Extract products are no different than a pure powdered Kratom product, as long as they are labeled appropriately for the serving sizes that are recommended by the manufacturer for the consumer. And those serving sizes should modulate the actual concentration of the alkaloids that are in the Kratom product, and they can be safely consumed. The difference is, depending on the product formulation, whether it's a leaf product or it's an extract product, if you were to ingest a liquid product, it is going to be more bioavailable to you, meaning that it gets into your system faster than through the gut, through a powdered product or a capsule product. And so it's just differences in the way that they're formulated, and those have to be different in terms of the instructions for safe use as we go forward. We want consumers to obviously be aware of and to be responsible for the kinds of products that they're ingesting and following those, obviously, those recommendations for safe use as we go forward. I want to talk a little bit too about something which I know many of you have already heard about, but it deserves some clarity, in that the case that has been filed by the federal government against a Kratom importer, where they indicted him, he pled guilty to importing under false pretenses. It's a violation of the Smuggling Act. And essentially, he classified Kratom coming into the United States as fertilizer or various forms of fabric dye or soil conditioner. And that's illegal. And he pled guilty to it. And in the course of sentencing, the federal government attempted to strengthen their case to persuade the judge that they should give him the maximum amount of time that he agreed to serve if the judge determined that. And so they started saying that Kratom was extremely dangerous. The judge had two questions. He told the defense, or the prosecutor, well, first you tell me that Kratom is sold throughout the United States. And the problem was that this particular defendant was importing it into the United States under false pretenses. And so that doesn't speak to kratom being dangerous at all if it's sold legally throughout the United States. And the second question he raised was that this defendant, prior to being indicted, had petitioned the FDA for release of the kratom raw materials that were mislabeled. And he paid a fine of $50,000 and a storage cost, but then was allowed to sell the kratom raw materials to manufacturers whom the judge properly characterized. Everybody, including the FDA, would have known that those materials were going to be sold to a manufacturer of a kratom product that would be ingested by a consumer. How is that justified? The prosecution argued back, and the judge said, okay, I want the FDA in my courtroom for what is known as a Brady hearing. So it's a very limited topic that's addressed by the court. And the judge said, I want the FDA here to describe with witnesses and documents why they, the FDA, have come to the conclusion that kratom is dangerous. And so he ordered that Brady hearing that was supposed to take place 2 weeks ago. The FDA refused to come to that hearing. And the basis for refusing to do so is that they claim to the judge in a federal court proceeding that the FDA has not yet come to the determination as to whether kratom is dangerous. Let me repeat that. The FDA has not yet come to the determination that kratom is dangerous. Now, that flies in the face of the 2012 import alert, where they said kratom was dangerous, and they maintained that throughout the 12 years or 13 years since that happened, and they continue to say it on an import alert. In the 2016 and 2018 recommendations for scheduling, under Factor 6 of the 8 factors, they say that kratom poses an imminent threat to the safety of the American public. You see in their FDA kratom website, in their update in July 21st of 2023, they say kratom shouldn't be ingested by people because it's unsafe. They went to the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and they made the case that kratom was dangerous and that it was killing people, and unanimously that group rejected that argument for insufficient evidence. The FDA does not have evidence that they can, in a court of law, under oath, describe kratom as being dangerous. But there's another significant thing that has just happened, and that is that many of you know that there was an announcement of a human abuse potential study that the FDA has published and are seeking contract research organizations to actually conduct this study. This is a human clinical trial to determine at what levels kratom ingestion creates dependence or addiction, and then to try to quantify what that level of addiction is, because we know that there are different levels of dependency versus dangerous levels of addiction. And what the FDA will attempt to do is demonstrate that kratom is dangerously addictive. That's their game, and that's what they want to say. But in order to make that announcement, which they did on January 16th, in order to do that, they first had to have completed a dose-finding study. A dose-finding study is a human clinical trial where the FDA took different doses of kratom and they kept ramping it up until they got to an adverse event, meaning that they waited for the person to become nauseous and vomit. And then they would classify that as the level at which that individual or the human being would be, and they have a broad cross-section of them, obviously. They have to be able to say that that's the level at which they saw the adverse event occurred. Human clinical trials. The early description of that data is that the FDA was profoundly disappointed in the result, meaning that the level of kratom prior to getting to an adverse event was much higher than they thought. And that, of course, is something that set them back in terms of their belief that kratom is dangerous. And how could they go to a court of law in the state of California, federal district court, and say to a judge it's dangerous when they just completed a human dose finding study that demonstrated, in fact, that undermines the complete argument that the FDA has made? It is a stunning admission by the FDA not to be willing to go and testify in front of court, because it undermines so much of what they've been claiming for the last decade, and upon which so many public health decisions have been made, and so many groups and people have been misled in this country by the FDA's narrative about kratom, which they are ultimately wrong on. And this is something that, of course, is very significant to us. And by the way, it's not the first time the FDA has been wrong. Overall, they're a good agency. They're good people that work there, but you have a group of policymakers at the FDA that are hell-bent to prosecute their case against botanical supplements and Kratom. And so they're hell-bent to do that, and they're going to continue to do so until they're called to account for their actions. And so this is a very significant advancement for the Kratom community to see this research and the evolution of that research and how it's playing out. Obviously, we're all concerned about making sure that the right kinds of product formulations that aren't on this rat race to keep making Kratom products more potent and therefore potentially more dangerous. And we're going to address that. But we have to do it on our terms because the FDA refuses to do its statutory duty to protect the American consumers. The federal KCPA will bring them to account, and we're going to continue to work on that at the federal level as we go forward. So these are all great things that are happening, and ultimately we're going to get to a position where the FDA will have to publish standards for the manufacturing of Kratom products and the appropriate labeling depending on product formulations for those products. We support that 100%, as long as it's done responsibly and as long as it's representative of the true science and not the bias that's been held by some of those people at the Food and Drug Administration. These are great times for the Kratom community. I know that there are always going to be people that have a different viewpoint than the American Kratom Association has. I know that there are many in the community who are frustrated with the fact that we would be advocating for regulations when, if we didn't do so, they believe that the FDA would leave them alone. I can assure you that is not the case. I'll give you an example. The FDA just at the end of December, maybe it was the end of November, went into a shop in Florida, and they've ordered a recall on a Kratom beverage that was there because it did not contain a label for the allergens that were in the product. A perfectly legitimate complaint by the FDA, by the way. So that's something that triggered a discussion, and the company did the voluntary recall. They submitted their remedial plan for fixing the labeling, and the FDA came back and said no, based on consultation with the Center for Food Safety and Nutrition, FDA headquarters, and reliance upon the FDA Kratom website update of July 21st of 23, they came down and said that Kratom could not be sold anywhere in the United States. That's final agency action, which has been the threshold that we've been trying to overcome in order to draw the FDA into a litigation posture. And so we're actively working on that right now. But my point is, anyone who believes that the FDA is willing to be reasonable is up in the night. They're just not going to be. And while we may have differences of opinion about the level of regulation that should be imposed on Kratom, we've tried to strike the balance. There are many in the community who want far more regulations than we are in a position to advocate for today, and there are many people that want far less. We think we've hit the right kind of regulatory framework, and we're going to continue to work on that, and we'll be informed by both the opinions of and the data that demonstrates exactly what the science community recommends that we do. And we're going to continue to follow their guidance as we go forward. So I'll conclude there with one additional information item, if I could. Many of you have responded to our call for nominations for our Legacy Hall of Fame. Now, there are two programs that we are really going to implement. The first of Hall of Fame will recognize those individuals in the 2016 era when we were fighting for Kratom to be kept legal in the face of the announced Federal Register notice from the FDA and the Drug Enforcement Administration to ban Kratom. It's those people we want to recognize. And we hope that you will make your recommendations. We're going to conclude those recommendations by the end of this month, and then our review panel will evaluate them. We hope to hold a webinar in probably the third week in February where we make these announcements and introduce these people. We will then, after that, recognize some of the great advocates that are helping us today. And we look forward to nominations for the regular Hall of Fame, and we will twice a year recognize 10 or so individuals that really deserve and should be honored for the work that they do virtually every day. Some of them go unnamed, but I can tell you that when we held our December 13th congressional briefing, and the number of advocates that showed up both in person and who supported it online and by advocating on social media outlets, are the kinds of people that need to be recognized, because too often the credit goes to the wrong people. We think, and I believe personally, that, and I've said it many times before, that we need to honor those people that really are in the trenches and in your foxhole. My father-in-law was a veteran of World War II, and he told me in one of the rare cases when he would talk about his experiences in the war, I asked him what the best advice he could give me about that, and he said, you make sure you have the right people in your foxhole. And I can tell you that we are honored to be in the foxhole with many of you that are really pulling in the same direction. And we respect those that don't agree with us. It doesn't mean that we'll let you consume us. We can engage in lots of different discussions, and I'm perfectly willing to do that, but we need to be focused on how we best serve this community, protect this plant from being banned, and make sure that the products that are out there are safely formulated and properly labeled. And that's our objective. And so we're going to continue to do that as much as we can. With that, I'll throw it open to the questions and answer questions anybody has, and glad to work on that. So Ryan, you want to coordinate this?
I will, Mac. Thank you very much. And our first question from Dion: if the FDA won't swear under oath that Kratom is a dangerous substance and they won't release the import ban or update their website, yet they continue to close shops and do everything that they are doing, how is this not an overreach and abuse of their power? How is this not something that Congress has not done something about? And why isn't this purely an abuse of power put a stop to?
So the points are all well taken. It is an abuse of power. The FDA is using its bully pulpit in order to encourage public health officials at the state and local levels to take enforcement actions against Kratom that are wholly unjustified on the science. The federal bureaucracy is a slow-moving ship, and if there's something slower than the federal bureaucracy, it is in fact the U.S. Congress. So we have to have a little patience here, but we're not going to rely solely on that effort. We're going to use every resource and tool we have to bring to light that the FDA is acting outside of its boundaries. We're now cooperating and working with some state attorney generals in the hopes that they will bring litigation against the FDA based on their final agency action, based on the fact that they announced that Kratom was dangerous in their FDA and Kratom website on July 21st of 2023, without doing the required rulemaking, which is a direct violation of the Administrative Procedures Act that they are required to go through, which takes a year to a year and a half. They didn't do that. And if they're going to rely on that website, as they did in the compliance action in Florida, they have a duty to do the Administrative Procedures Act requirement to do rulemaking. So we've got lots of tools that we're going to use. We're going to continue to work hard on it. I feel and sense the frustration, because I wake up every day and I say, what are these people thinking? But I'll just go back to what happened in 1994 for a 15-year period leading up to the passage of the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. The FDA was doing exactly the same thing against dietary supplements as they're doing against Kratom today. They were using their bully pulpit. They were trying to stop and interdict the sale of dietary supplements and vitamins. It was bizarre. And finally, Congress came to its senses and said, this is enough. We got to pass this bill. So ultimately, I think that's going to be our solution at the federal level. But we can continue to fight at the state level in order to secure and protect Kratom sales by passage of the Kratom Consumer Protection Act.
Thank you, Mac. And from Bud, is this Nevada meeting open for Kratom users to speak?
So the Nevada panel presentation will, obviously everyone's invited to come. We'll have the presentation by the panelists. We're hoping that there will be time for question and answer. So it's not going to be a testimony, but you certainly can speak and ask questions of the panelists, and we hope to reserve time for that to take place.
Great. And is it possible that the Wisconsin Controlled Substance Board will come to a conclusion before September, allowing the bill to pass sooner?
It's a good question. You can never predict with 100% certainty that somebody won't do something really odd. But we already know after a year of review of all of the existing evidence in 2023 that the Controlled Substance Board in Wisconsin came to the conclusion, and it was a fairly strong conclusion based on the vote of the members, that it didn't meet the criteria. Since then, it's gotten worse in terms of science. And so I cannot foresee any legitimate basis for the Controlled Substance Board to make any claim that the 8 factors are met. And in fact, with the FDA's latest admission that they can't come to a determination that kratom is dangerous, how in the world could that Controlled Substance Board do anything but that? So I think it's a very low risk proposition. It gets us the passage out of the committee, which is important, and it gets us to the floor, and it's a facilitator for us getting done. I really believe that we have a very solid case to make here. And I'm willing, I think, at this point, to accept the risk because it would be totally unjustified on the science if the Controlled Substances Board did something crazy. And the majority of that board has already made it clear that they don't think that the old evidence, which has now gotten better for us, justified scheduling at that point.
Thank you. And I believe that answers Heidi's next question. Next, what can I do to help in Round Rock, Texas?
I honestly don't know the problem in Round Rock, Texas. I'd love to know. I know that there are local jurisdictions that will occasionally, based on input from misinformed individuals or groups, try to ban kratom. Texas has a Kratom Consumer Protection Act. It does not prohibit a local jurisdiction from taking action that would limit kratom sales or ban them. We're welcome to get more information, send us more information, and we'll go to work on seeing if we can help in Round Rock, Texas.
Great. And somewhere I heard that Florida was talking about restricting our kratom by only allowing us to have kratom that's only Florida grown and processed in our state. Is any of this true?
So it's not true, but it's a legitimate question because the way that it was worded by some of the original investigators that went in and actually did reports on kratom, they said that one of the reports said there had to be a verification of the source of kratom. And based on the FDA's import alert, it was illegal to sell anything but homegrown kratom. The Department of Agriculture Florida determined that that was an inappropriate action by that investigator, and they rescinded it. But it sparked the concern. There was a second level of concern that was associated with that, where in the kratom rule that was proposed by the Department of Agriculture, they had a sourcing requirement. And again, that was just stalking for the FDA. And we have strongly argued against that. And we have an agreement about how this can be, the Kratom Consumer Protection Act can be implemented, and it will not restrict kratom having to be just grown in Florida or even in the United States. It will allow for the importation of kratom raw materials.
And is there anything that can be done about these medical examiners and coroners listing kratom as cause of death when there's clearly other reasons?
Every time we get the chance, we need to help educate those medical examiners. I've testified about this in a number of venues addressing this issue. The problem is that you have medical examiners who will, for whatever reasons, and the reasons are typically they believe the FDA or they've listened at medical examiners conferences, groups like the NMS Labs, which is the leading forensics toxicologist company in the United States, who does the majority of forensic toxicology work for police departments, sheriff's departments, and coroners and medical examiners, where they jawbone people or mislead them in terms of the cause of death. The thing that we are advocating for is what the Centers for Disease Control recommended in their 2019 report, which is that there should be a standardized postmortem investigation protocol, which means that you just don't use the word of a family member that says, oh, the decedent used kratom, and use that as a basis for determining that kratom was a cause of death. You don't use a protocol for toxicology testing that doesn't properly account for the time of death, the degradation of the body between the time of death and when testing occurs, where you have a dispersal of the other substances that may in fact have caused the death. You simply have to look at the data. The Centers for Disease Control took 91 deaths that were reported by medical examiners and coroners to be kratom associated. And when they examined those, all but 7 had fentanyl, morphine, heroin, cocaine as a contributing cause of death. Kratom played no role. Excuse me, the taken document. But they said 7 were kratom only. So the Centers for Disease Control looked at those and found, for the ones that were available blood samples, that they were actually polydrug use. The medical examiners either didn't test or they didn't have the equipment that was sophisticated enough to examine this. A report that was similarly was done by Colorado medical examiners and published in the New England Journal of Medicine, looked at over a 10-year period, 15 kratom deaths, of which they said 4 were kratom only. And when they tested the 4, 3 of which had blood samples, those 3 tested for polydrug use because they didn't use the right kind of equipment. So I'm not going to blame a medical examiner because he checks a box because he thinks or she thinks that kratom is associated with the death. I blame the FDA. I blame the Medical Examiners Association for not having post-mortem protocols for examining this. Now, what can we do? Challenge it everywhere we can. Most of you know about the courageous mother in Ohio who testified at the Ohio hearing, where she has sued the medical examiner or the coroner there in Ohio. And what we found out is stunning. First off, in the state of Ohio, there is a 1-year minimum requirement to retain blood samples. On the 8th month, the attorney for this woman, and by the way, the AK is supporting this lawsuit financially. In the 8th month, the request was made for that blood sample, and that blood sample had been destroyed. That's a spoliation of evidence charge that's been filed in that court case. More importantly, when the coroner tried to get out of that and said, well, but we also sent it to. And so the question was to NMS Labs, well, what did you find in terms of other drugs, and what were the concentrations of metrogeny? Well, the answers were stunning. First off, the level of metrogeny concentration in the blood of the decedent was a third of what NMS Labs itself says is a level of concern. It was about 330 or nanograms per milliliter. And the level of concern, not that it's toxic level, the level of concern is 1,000 by NMS Lab standards. And the NMS people say, we wouldn't have called that a kratom death, but the Ohio coroner did. And then the second question to the NMS Labs is, what other drugs showed up in the tox screen? The only thing that they were requested to test for was metrogeny by the coroner. This is not a legitimate finding by a coroner, and it needed to be challenged. And we think that as we take on these cases, and we've got a couple of others we're working on, similar circumstances, then I think the message will get out to the medical examiners. You are at risk if you call this a kratom death and you don't have the evidence and the data that support that conclusion. Just because you make friends with the FDA when you do it doesn't mean it's a good thing to do. And by the way, it deprives the families of those that have lost a loved one from the truth. We may not like the truth, by the way. And you know, if a kratom actually caused the death, I wouldn't like the truth, but we have a right to the truth, and not some schlocky investigation that is premised on some bias that is embedded by the FDA or medical examiners that try to excuse away poor protocols in order to call these kratom deaths. So we're aggressively challenging them. And every time we get a case like this, we look at it where we can obtain the autopsy, we review it, and we find that there are deficiencies. We're going to challenge it as we go forward. So that's the best we can do. I think as more of these cases come forward, I think it'll be a chilling effect on these medical examiners and coroners that just willy-nilly decide to check that box and say it was a kratom death just because kratom was detected. It is not surprising that you would have a death of someone who's struggling to get off of very dangerous opioids, uses kratom to do it, and they lose that battle in the middle of the journey. Not surprising at all. But to call kratom as a cause of death when there's no toxic level that's been identified by any scientist is simply improper and irresponsible.
Thank you, Mac. And is Dr. McCurdy included in any research moving forward?
In my conversations with Dr. Volko, who's the director of the National Institutes on Drug Abuse, she is wholly committed to increased science on kratom. And she informed me that there's been just under $100 million, which is substantially higher than we had learned before. It's up by 3 times what we had been told. And Dr. McCurdy and his group are the leading contractors for much of that research. Now it's spread out to other groups too, but this is exciting news. And Dr. McCurdy continues to do research in this area. And I know there are some who will sit and say, well, Dr. McCurdy said this, and I don't agree with that. Science isn't about finding, it's not a popularity contest, and it's not about finding what people want you to say. It's about finding the truth. Now, within that scientific research, there are questions that emerge about conclusions and data that they're subject to some interpretation, and we all learn from it. I know when I started out in 2016, I would tell people that Kratom was not addictive. And the science has now proven that, in fact, Kratom can be, depending on the levels of ingestion of a Kratom product, you can become dependent on it. Now, it's what Dr. Kirsten Smith, formerly of NIDA, now at Johns Hopkins, called Kratom a boring topic, which accounts for why there's not enough research on it, because the level of addiction is not all that significant. People that do get addicted or dependent on Kratom have a relatively mild experience in withdrawing from it. It's not the kind of thing that you see with dangerous drugs along the way. So the critics of the scientists, including Dr. McCurdy, I think are unfounded. We can have discussions, and I think that all of us can learn from one another, and we can learn from the data as it goes forward. But I think Dr. McCurdy's calling balls and strikes so far, and I expect that to continue. And in the areas where we interpret the data differently, we can have those robust discussions. And he's the kind of scientist that I think will listen and be a part of that discussion to find the best conclusion that we can draw from that evidence and data.
Is the FDA required to release findings of the dose finding study?
That's a great question. I don't know yet. We've asked, and we're waiting to hear back from them. The preliminary response that we got informally was that this is a protected result because it's soon to be published. In fact, it's scheduled for publication in September of this year. I don't think that's a good enough justification not to release that data, and so we're going to challenge it. But we hope that we get the answer from that, because obviously it's better for us, given that they have now cleared the human abuse potential study, which the dose finding study had to ethically be conducted and concluded along the way. So I'm encouraged by that, but we're going to continue to pursue that. Worst case is we'll learn about it in September when they actually present the findings at a medical conference. It is not unusual, by the way, for authors of medical research to want to withhold that data because it impairs publication, because then it's not news. Again, they're a federal agency. I don't think that's a good justification, but we'll see how that plays out.
And Mac, what are your opinions about these new regulations that Kratom can't be sold 1,000 feet near school zones? It looks like Illinois modified the Kratom Control Act to include this.
So the conflict here is that we know what the optimum public policy is, and there's certainly no evidence to suggest that there is any abuse of Kratom by children. There are natural limiting factors to that. But the opposing force is, how do you get a bill passed? And sometimes we have to make concessions, and this is one of them. And I personally don't mind making that concession to say you can't sell Kratom within a certain distance of a school, because it's better that the Kratom is readily accessible to the public and legal than it is to lose votes and lose the legislation, because you have some legislators who this is a personal quirk for, because they believe they're protecting children. And I'm willing to accept that. Personally, I think the AKA has shown that we're willing to work on those kind of issues. It's not the optimum public policy.
And how do you propose to do proper labeling and regulation of Kratom served at kava bars?
So the Kratom drink is just like any product formulation. It's the amount of metrogenine that is served in a serving and proper labeling. So I'm seeing placards in kava Kratom bars that will describe exactly what the contents of the drink that they're purchasing and consuming, and they'll be able to define for themselves what their limits are. And I think that's the best way to do it. It's exactly what should be on a product that's available on a counter or behind the counter, depending on the case, depending on the state. I think that's where we are on that. So I think that reasonably Kava Kratom bars can continue to dispense their products, and they just have to have a declaration in the store about the levels of metrogenine and other alkaloids that are in the drinks that are being sold.
Thank you, Mac. And our final two questions here. Where does the VA stand on Kratom?
The VA mirrors the military policy, which is Kratom is not allowed to be sold at military commissaries. That's unfortunate. And the VA has a position that's consistent with that, saying that Kratom cannot be used as a therapeutic agent in the administration of acute and chronic pain for service-related injuries. Congressman Bergman, a former lieutenant general in the Marine Corps, is strongly opposed to that. And I think we're seeing some enlightenment and education taking place, but that's going to be, again, that slow-moving bureaucracy. We're going to continue to work on it.
And is there any new issues arising in North Carolina?
Well, the North Carolina House passed our bill. It's over in the Senate. They're dealing with budget issues. I am not aware of what those issues are that might be of concern. We've addressed every question that's been raised. We have regular meetings with our lobbying team and with members as questions arise, and we're going to continue to pursue that. Love to hear specifics on what concerns that might exist, because that would help inform us on what responses we should make appropriately to those legislators.
Thank you, Mac. That's all I'm seeing. And thank you all for a great evening. I'll turn it over to Mac for closing comments.
Yeah, one of the things I want to address, and I know that this is a difficult issue for some, and that is that we hear our critics, and the critics are in the form of the Kratom Danger Awareness Group. I think they're extremists, and I say that because you listen to their narrative, you watch what they say. They don't want to have an open dialogue. I've asked to join that group for the purpose of having a discussion, and the response was that I am the child of Satan and of Hitler. That's the kind of extremist language. That's not a responsible group. They should not be listened to until they're willing to come into a civil discourse about the actual Kratom situation in terms of its safety. I talked to the wife of a Georgia man who died ostensibly of a Kratom overdose, and she testified at the hearing yesterday in Georgia. She came up to me afterwards and said, "I'm not against Kratom. I'm not for it being banned, but I think it should be regulated the way you've described." And she even offered to have a further discussion when she concludes all of the legal matters where she could become an advocate. That's a responsible position. Now, I don't know, and she doesn't know what was in the Kratom product that her husband took, and we don't know if there are other adulterants in it. But I can tell you that the extreme position, and I know they're on here tonight, and I challenge them, if they want to be responsible, then come to the forum where we can have these kind of discussions and stop the nonsense. Because I will tell you this, when we see a comment that's put on the AK website over which we have, or the social media platforms over which we have control, and someone says something that is blatantly extreme like that, then we take it off because we have that control. It is not our purpose to try to demonize any individual. And yet the Kratom Danger Awareness people not only allow it, they encourage it and they applaud it when it happens. And that's really unfortunate because we'll never get to a resolution of this issue. But the question is always, well, how do we react to those people? Well, all I can tell you is we can only do it with kindness and love. We can't, what's the point? What's the point of engaging in someone that wants to engage in extremist behavior that you can't control, and they just get inflamed, and then you'll read it after I've made this statement. They'll say, there goes Mac Haddo again, the child of Satan, the son of Hitler. That's what they'll say. And to me, they don't deserve any kind of commentary until they're willing to come forward and actually have a conversation, a decent civil conversation in areas we can't agree. Because I've seen where I've been able to get a glimpse into their protected social media platform. I've seen people that have the same views I have about Kratom, and they are being driven by this crazy extremist kind of narrative about Kratom that really doesn't make much sense. So it's irresponsible, in my opinion, and I think that people should just recognize that going forward. But we should recognize we have the same thing on our side. we have people that are extremists. And I discover them all the time. And some of you may have seen some of the recent social media interactions. I try to answer questions, and then it devolves into something that I can't even track because they don't like the answers. And they're talking about things that occurred 4 or 5 years ago that don't have any relevance to today in terms of what the current evidence and data is. They're on our side. And yet they criticize me because I'm not willing to engage with them in the forum that they want me to engage them with. I offer to have phone calls. I offer to have Zoom calls with them. Then they say, oh, we're afraid on a Zoom call, you'll cut and paste it. I said, you can record it. All of that is designed to try to come to a commonality of discussion and decency. And unfortunately, we have them on both sides. And by the way, in this country, you have the right to be extreme. You can do whatever you want and right to hold your views, but that doesn't mean that I have to subject myself to it, nor do you. We can ignore those people, and we can continue to advocate for the fundamental quality of creative materials that we want to be represented in products, and that we want to preserve and protect the legality of kratom as responsibly used. That's our goal. And we're going to continue to work on that. We'll try not to get too distracted with some of these other things. And where people make good points, I think we should listen. When they just want to yell, I think we ignore them. And that's sort of sometimes hard to tell the difference because people can yell and make good points. And I'm all in favor of listening to those kinds of comments and recommendations and suggestions. We are open at the American Kratom Association to your suggestions. We welcome it. We want to be responsive. We do the best we can. We have a relatively small staff for the enormity of this group. We want to do a better job, but we also want to keep our eye focused on our objectives here as we go forward. So I deeply respect everybody in this community. I understand that there are times we're going to disagree, and I respect that as well. I just hope we can find a way to smooth out some of the disagreements and agree to disagree on some and share the common goal of trying to keep kratom legal in the United States. And I'm going to continue to do that as long as I can. And we're grateful for your support in the community, the majority of you supporting us in that effort. And we continue to call upon you to do lots of things, financial support, support on advocacy efforts. You've been magnificent. We're deeply appreciative. And I'm in your debt personally, because I see you come both to advocate for us on social media platforms, to show up when you can and make the sacrifice at these hearings. It's very affirming, and we appreciate it deeply. So thank you.